down and make some room.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like. On the tip of the world.
Do you remember the company Hanjin? It was an ocean carrier that filed for bankruptcy in 2016. I thought today might be a good time to revisit that cautionary tale of the Hanjin bankruptcy. There are just some parallels I'm starting to notice, just noticing, between the industry now and that of maybe the early mid-2010s. It just has me sitting up a little straighter and paying attention a little more closely. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, story number 1. There's some recaps here, right? So story number 1 is Commissioner Carl Bensel with his Maritime Transportation Data Initiative released his RFI, the request for information. We covered that in more detail a few weeks ago. This is an opportunity to consider and comment on the MTDI recommendations and views report, so the MTDI report. The RFI actually closed, this request for information closed just this week on October 16th. I've been talking about it in the story of the week, and we even covered it in more detail just 2 weeks ago. But comments are actually still coming in, even as recently as yesterday. So far, there have been 39 comments received. That is phenomenal. I love it. That means that people are paying attention to the FMC, people are engaged, and people care about this MTDI project, and they want to comment on it. I'm thrilled to see such a range of interest, too. We have so many stakeholders in the supply chain represented of the 39 comments. So you have trucking, you have dray, you have railroad, you have ocean carriers, you have shippers, you have associations. It's such a good mix. And there's actually some great information in those comments, too. Most took the route of answering the questions that were presented by their kind of stakeholder category. But look, read through these. Maybe it's going to inspire you to file comments yourself. So far, it seems that comments actually haven't been turned away. Like I said, they were still receiving comments as of yesterday, October 19th. So it looks like in true FMC fashion, right? The FMC tends to allow late filed comments. It looks like they're allowing late filed comments again here, which is wonderful because it's less about the must be submitted by the 16th and more about getting the industry to weigh in and to have that conversation through the comments. So look, it was closed on the 16th. As of the 19th, they were still accepting. I think that you'd be safe to read through the comments, see if it maybe inspires you to file your own comments, and go ahead and file comments on this matter. You can't complain if you don't engage, right? And so this is a moment where the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative, talking about data and communication and how data is exchanged, such a huge topic, is being opened up for a conversation with the industry. So look, there's a series of questions broken down by supply chain stakeholder group, importers, exporters, transportation service providers. I'm sure they wouldn't mind general comments and general statements submitted as well, just as kind of responsive to the MTDI report. I covered this, like I said, a few weeks ago, so go check out that previous episode. Go check out the 39 comments that were filed and engage, jump in, have a conversation with the overall MTDI process here, the whole initiative. I think that this is such a great thing that there were 39 comments that have come in so far, and I'm just really thrilled that many people are engaging. It's so important to do that. Go take a look yourself, and I hope that you either file comments or find it valuable and beneficial to read through the comments that were filed. All right, story number 2. We also covered this in more detail actually just last week, but like we said last week, I want to make sure that this is on people's radars because it is a big deal. On October 10th, the European Union, through the European Commission, decided not to extend the antitrust block exemption for liner shipping consortia. So the limited antitrust immunity that existed in the antitrust laws of the European Union will now expire April 2024. Now, this was part of just a routine look. We covered this in a lot more detail last week, where we look at what year, how many years the periodic, system of the European Union reviewing this. 2024 was when this was set to expire, just in the next round. So they were reviewing it periodically, and this was the recent review. I'm not sure this is going to have the major booming impact that some are saying it will. But I do think that it might contribute to some larger planning conversations that stakeholders in the industry and in the general supply chain ecosystem are having anyways. We're going to discuss that a little bit larger later in the episode today. But first, let me just kind of break down all that. What does all this mean? Let me break it down so that we kind of translate it so we all understand what the block exemption repeal for consortia is. So consortia, so let's break that down. Consortia, we always talk about alliances here. Essentially, consortia is the same thing. The European Union calls it consortia. We essentially, in the United States, call it alliance. So in the United States, we have the Shipping Act that provides a limited antitrust immunity, meaning, look, we understand that some of these vessel sharing agreements might border or might actually be monopolies. We're going to have a special exemption for that vessel sharing agreement so that it's protected. It's filed with the Federal Maritime Commission. It doesn't get filed with the European Commission through their different antitrust immunities, structures, systems. But that's essentially what's going on here, right? So a limited antitrust immunity for alliances in the U.S. and other agreements that may potentially be monopolistic under general antitrust laws were carved out under the Shipping Act. That's essentially the same thing that's happening over in the European Union under this consortia block exemption regulation. It was adopted in 2009. It allows liner shipping operators, so cargo, consistent cargo movement of vessels, so liner shipping. With a combined market share below 30%, it allowed them to work together to provide joint cargo transport services, so essentially vessel sharing, as long as they don't fix the prices, right? And that's kind of the same across the board. Prices really cannot be fixed. They cannot be discussed. They cannot come anywhere near these vessel sharing agreements. They have to stay competitive, but this was an operational cooperative thing. So that's what's happening. The European Union decided to repeal that. So it's going to be in effect through its extension of the current iteration. So once April comes around, this is going to get repealed. Like I said, is this going to have a major impact? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's just going to be a little tweaking here and there of maybe some of the alliance structures that are out there right now. But I don't think, and even from the report, that it was saying that not all of the alliances or not all of the vessel sharing agreements actually were enjoying this limited antitrust benefit. So we'll see. Like I said, I think that this might contribute to larger conversations. I don't think this is the doom and gloom that, or the big win that some people are kind of touting. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute here. But story number 3, look, this is by land and by sea. So we're going to talk a little bit about the by land. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. We're also going to be folding this into the larger conversation. But Convoy, a Seattle-based digital freight broker, filed for bankruptcy this week. Now, this was the company backed by Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, so Amazon, Microsoft, and it was intended to disrupt the sleepy, low-tech freight brokerage business. But I guess it didn't work, right? I mean, they went bankrupt. Look, this story leads us into the larger conversation today and the cautionary tale of Hanjin, and is part of the parallels I guess I'm seeing. So let's jump right into it. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day, a cautionary tale of Hanjin. Let's chat Convoy, and let's chat Yellow Freight. We didn't really talk about that this summer. I think I was on the summer break from the episodes. So, like I said, we cover mostly ocean side of things, but this is both by land and by sea. So I'd be remiss in not pointing out the recent bankruptcies of 2 major companies on the land side movement of cargo. Just mentioned Convoy, but you also had Yellow Freight. And as you probably are aware, if you follow landside freight movement, or maybe you weren't aware, over the summer in August, Yellow, the freight trucking company, declared bankruptcy and left over 30,000 people without jobs pretty much overnight. This was a surprise to the industry for the most part. Look, I read a few people saying here and there they saw it coming, the writing was on the wall. But when one of the U.S.'s largest freight carriers declares bankruptcy, this yellow freight, it will no doubt send shockwaves into the supply chain ecosystem, and people will be surprised that it happened. Even if you saw the writing on the wall, I think everyone was surprised that it actually happened. So fast forward to this week. You may have seen that Convoy filed for bankruptcy. So like I said, Convoy, Seattle-based digital freight broker, founded to disrupt the outdated low-tech freight brokerage business, as kind of identified and explained by a CNBC article that I'm going to link to in the notes here. Notably, Convoy actually raised $260 million, which gave them a $3.8 billion valuation just 18 months ago. And like I said, also notably, this company was backed by Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Bill Gates of Microsoft and co-founded by some Amazon people. So, I mean, it had some pretty heavy names associated with its even creation and existence. So that's land, right? So why should ocean-minded folks be paying attention to this? Well, obvious reasons, right? The entire ecosystem, the entire supply chain is an ecosystem. And so you really should be kind of at least marginally aware of what's going on the land side if you deal with ocean, and ocean if you deal with land. That was one of the major things that I think was a breakdown during the COVID congestion period, was there was a clear delineation between the two siloed worlds of land and sea, which was kind of the precipice of why I wanted to start this podcast. But look, it triggered a thought for me this week, and it's maybe something that those of you who are newer to the industry may not be aware of, but a little less than 10 years ago, right about 7-ish years ago, a large ocean carrier company went bankrupt. Hanjin. Yes, too big to fail, right? So look, too big to fail failed. Now, I know it's maybe hard to believe, but we just came through a period of time where ocean carriers were making billions of dollars, and we're still seeing some of the readouts of some of those marquee profitable years. And so, I mean, you're kind of thinking, okay, ocean carriers make money. Look, every time I talk about those billions of dollars of profits, I have to mention, I always mention, but I have to mention, nobody was more surprised by those numbers than the ocean carriers themselves. For many years, they were lucky to make any profit at all, and some of those years actually put up a loss for the year. So what happened with Hanjin? It had me thinking. I wanted to look back into it. With the large bankruptcies happening on the land side of things, it just got me thinking about bankruptcies generally, surprise bankruptcies, Convoy, yellow trucks. I thought I'd look back a little bit at the Hanjin bankruptcy on the ocean shipping side, and JOC actually had a great article that outlines the timeline of what happened and when for Hanjin. I'm going to link it in the notes. And most of the information actually is coming from that article that kind of does a great historical snapshot of what happened. I think it was probably written after it was written after the bankruptcy happened, and kind of looked back at the things leading up to it. So look, thinking back, I guess I wasn't as aware of the specifics of at the time, or maybe I was and I'd kind of forgotten some of these things. So I'm really glad that I looked back at it. But whenever I talk about the cautionary time when the ocean carriers were lucky to end the year not in the red, well, this is the time that I'm talking about, right? So in the early to mid 2010s, and it was a rough time for some ocean carriers. And while 2016 saw the beginning of ocean alliances, as we know them now, we've covered that. I've done an episode that was an Alliance 101, and as 2M, the dissolution announcement of 2M, we covered that 2M was created in 2016. It was also a very strange time where a very large ocean carrier declared bankruptcy and went out of business, right? Like I said, too big to fail. So in looking back at the Hanjin bankruptcy, I came across, like I said, this JOC article that had a nice infographic that outlined the timeline. And one point that stood out to me in that infographic and in that article was that Hanjin lost $487 million in 2011. They had just set a profit the year before of $229 million. Totally erasing that. So 2010, they saw $229 million. They lost more than double that the very next year and lost $487 million in 2011. Like I said, some of the years were in red. They weren't just kind of in red. That's almost $500 million in red. Now remember, this was all around the global financial downturn, right? So 2008, 2009, 2010, they were some of the worst financial years in recent history. And Hanjin actually had $1 billion in losses in 2009. $1 billion of losses in 2009. And then the debt just started to snowball. So that was 2009. They had the $1 billion of debt or losses. By 2010, they had kind of, I mean, not totally made up for that, but they were back in the black. They had 229 million of profits, and then 2011 they saw 487 million in debt or in losses again. And then from there, the debt just started to snowball, and it grew so large that Hanjin by 2016 had accrued more than $5 billion in debt. And in 2015, they posted a profit of only $6 million, right? So they only had $6 million. I was just talking about $229 million in 2010. By 2015, they had only kind of come mildly up to $6 million. Again, against that $5 billion in debt that had snowballed, that $6 million was kind of a drop in the bucket. And how funny, we're talking in millions and billions here. Millions and billions. And this was in the mid-2010s. So what was happening during this time that contributed to all of that? Well, in 2015, container ship fleets hit record 20 million TEUs, and ship orders were placed, and they were growing in 2015, nearly 100% year over year, generally kind of across the industry, despite overcapacity, right? So we were seeing vessels being purchased. 2015, we were seeing vessels being purchased. We were seeing rates starting to go down. We were seeing overcapacity driving down some of those rates. I mean, this is starting to sound a little familiar, right? In 2016, we saw some of the most record lows for spot rates and contract rates of the time. We saw Trans-Pacific to the U.S. West Coast, so Asia to the West Coast. We saw rates around $750, where they typically were in the $1,800, $1,800, or maybe even $2,000 range. So once Hanjin filed for bankruptcy. So that was just kind of paint the picture of what was happening during that time. So once Hanjin actually filed for bankruptcy, things got a little chaotic. It was a surprise to the industry that they actually did. There were some things, and certainly the JOC article explains, you know, the debtors took over, and then there was some word that maybe they weren't paying operational companies, and it was the writing was on the wall, but still, for the actual bankruptcy to happen was still, I mean, I remember it to be surprising. So Hanjin filed for bankruptcy, and this is from the JOC article, and I'm going to be mostly reading, kind of paraphrasing from that article. They filed for bankruptcy on August 31st, 2016. And like I said, that was after months of trying to raise liquidity and restructure its debt, triggering a mad scramble by shippers to locate and gain control of their containers. And again, I'm mostly reading this off the JOC article. Hanjin vessels were arrested. Ports were refusing to work with Hanjin ships for fear that they wouldn't actually be paid. This was all in 2016. I mean, it was getting chaotic. Hanjin Shipping's collapse is by far the largest container shipping bankruptcy in history. And again, when this article was written, it said, and the consequences will continue to reverberate throughout international supply chains and the transportation sector. I can tell you that even as recently as 2018, 2017, 2018, 2019, there were still Hanjin containers out there in the wild that were still trying to figure out how to get rid of them off the port. They were just taking up space on ports. So why was I thinking about all of this? You know, like where was my head going? I'm kind of outlining and pointing out some of these parallels, but I wanted to paint this picture of the mid-2010s. Look, current time, we just came off these record profit years, right? Billions of dollars of profits. And now we're starting to see some of the rates drop out. And we're starting to see some vessel orders. Well, we were seeing vessel orders being made during those record profit years. And now we're seeing demand go down. And so we're seeing maybe a touch of overcapacity. And these are rough observations, right? I just want to say, look, I may not be fully comparing apples to apples here. I haven't done a true comparative analysis to really assess the magnitude of the rate drops in the vessel orders comparing 2015, 2016 to now. I'm just pointing out that there seems to be a parallel. There were profits, vessels were ordered. Now we're seeing the rates drop out expectantly, right? We've talked many times about this being a pendulum that swings back and forth. It's swinging away from the profits, and now the rates are dropping. The vessels are hitting the market, but also the old vessels are coming out of service. So that's helping with some of that overcapacity, meaning too much space, not enough demand. Look, it might still be no big deal. I'm just noticing this. But here's what I wanted to say. We didn't have alliances in 2015 necessarily. They really started forming together, these alliances, as we know, in 2016 and the few years thereafter. And I know that we've seen in some and they're seen in some circles as the big bad guy, right? These alliances, but the alliances really aren't that. I've talked about that before. I really truly believe that the alliances, these vessel sharing operational agreements aren't the bad guy. They've been improperly villainized. And if anything, the alliances have helped provide better route options and often better rates. So instead of 2 or 3 competition vessels sailing half empty, right, and going essentially the same route, so you have 2 or 3 vessels that are sailing from U.S. West Coast to China or vice versa, China to U.S. West Coast, and they're all about half full or a third full, and they're all doing the same route. Now, because of these operational alliances, these vessel sharing agreements, they can combo efforts, right? They can share that space and they can free up the superfluous vessels and allow them to go into other ports. They could go into a medium port or even a small port. So instead of 3 vessels, a third full, you can combine all that cargo onto one of those vessels. They're still competing for rates. It's not saying that the rates are now, being aligned. The rates can't have anything to do with this operational agreement. It just, in turn, frees up the superfluous vessels. So now those 3 vessels turn into the 1 vessel that's full. And so now you have 2 empty vessels that are allowed and freed up to go somewhere else. So you're seeing some of these ports that didn't get a lot of service prior to 2016 and the creation of these alliances were getting service, right? They were getting served. So we were creating more diversity in ports of call and therefore more diversity in routes. Same number of vessels, that would be an apples to apples. Same number of vessels, you still have the 3, but instead of 3 sailing the same route, a third full, they were able to be better utilized of the ship space and freed up the possibility of other stops. So that's me saying why I like alliances, right? Why I tend to like alliances and why I think that they provided do still provide a great service to the industry. So this is all against the backdrop of the block exemption being repealed by the European Union last week, right? We just covered it in a full episode a couple weeks ago. We just talked about it as a reminder in our top 3 stories of the week. This was cheered on as a win by some. And although I'm not entirely sure what we're going to see and if we're going to see a huge impact from it at all, most of these vessel sharing agreements were much smaller in vessel capacity, kind of as part of the overall vessel sharing agreement than I think most assumed. I think a lot of the reporting early on when things were starting to go wild during COVID and congestion time was just assuming that these large companies sent all of their vessels and made available all of their vessels for this vessel sharing. And that's not the case. They did not make all of their vessels. It was a limited fraction of what these companies had to offer that were part of these vessel sharing. And so what I'm watching, look, I don't think that this repeal is going to have this major effect, but what I'm watching is it might just be one more thing to add to the complicating factors column when alliances are starting to make the decision about whether to continue the vessel sharing alliances, these global alliances that we know. So we already had 2M announcing their dissolution. Remember, we got that news at the turn of the new year this year. So January 2023, we did a whole episode, maybe a couple episodes on that. So go back and check that out on the podcast list. But so now we have THE Alliance, the High Efficiency Alliance, and Ocean Alliance. Look, no news or hints on any plans to dissolve, but as we've covered many times on this show, they do have some expiration potential dates coming up. They weren't allowed to expire until they hit a certain date. 2027 is one of them and 2030 is the other. 2M had 2025 as their expiration cannot expire before. So it almost wasn't surprising. They had a 2-year dissolution clause in their agreement. So it almost wasn't surprising to see. So maybe we'll get to 2027 and see the same thing from one of these alliances. So what happens in a world without alliances, right? Well, we could potentially go back to these inefficient vessel fills of cargo, right? We could go back to instead of one vessel having all 3 vessels cargo on one, and then the other containers are free, or the other cargo vessels are free to go somewhere else. We might see 3 vessels, a third full, just chugging along the same route again. And the larger companies can weather the downturn of rates, but the smaller companies might not be able to. And so what could happen when companies can't weather the downturn of rates? Well, they could go bankrupt, or they could get bought up by larger companies, right? They cannot sustain multiple years of debt. And we saw from 2009 to 2016, Hanjin going through these downturned years. They had a couple profitable years, but really during those Hanjin years, as we explained, we saw $400 million losses in a year. So they could get bought up by larger companies, right? So that's kind of the potential danger. And the very consolidation of the market that people are actually saying happens through alliances, I mean, I'd argue isn't really happening because it's an operational sharing. It's not an actual consolidation. That actual consolidation could actually happen without the alliances, right? So let's kind of break it down. Let's use the 2M alliance as the example, right? It's going to be dissolved by 2025, but it's easy because there's only two companies that are part of it. So in this example, right? So right now they are vessel operationally sharing space. But what happens if instead of MSC sending cargo on some of Maersk's vessel, right? Those are the two companies that are part of this global alliance, 2M. So instead of MSC sending cargo on some of Maersk's vessels, helping to fill the ship while also staying competitive in rates against Maersk on their rates, now we would have, I mean, and this is, right, Maersk is a large company. So this would be kind of assuming if Maersk was one of the smaller companies at risk. We would have, if MSC wasn't sending their cargo, Maersk might be struggling to fill its vessels, not generating enough business to cover their operating costs of sailing those vessels, right? So we have, instead of the two vessels and MSC and Maersk both put it on one vessel through this vessel sharing agreement, now you have these two vessels running the same route because the alliance is gone. But maybe the second company couldn't sustain that. Maybe they couldn't sustain the costs of running that vessel as frequently. So they either start offering less routing, and so maybe they start losing customers because they offer less routing, and they just can't keep up with the larger companies. Look, in that scenario, MSC, the larger company who can weather the downturns, would buy up the smaller company. That is consolidation. That potentially could be consolidation. Now, I'm not saying that would automatically become problematic. I mean, maybe in this example, MSC versus Maersk, they are some of the two largest companies out there. So that might cause some potential problems. I don't see Maersk going anywhere anytime soon. But what about some of these smaller companies, right? I mean, essentially, the larger companies just now get a discount on these smaller companies that can't weather these storms. And it'll just sail all of its cargo under its new rebranded large company name. See the potential problem? See how the alliances helped alleviate that and protect against that and still maintained the possibility of these smaller companies to weather these storms? They were still getting cargo to move. And so while it wasn't their benefit, they were sharing the space, they were still able to move it around and weather those storms because they were able to put their cargo on other vessels too if they needed to slow down their own routes. So Federal Maritime Commission Chairman Dan Maffei recently actually had similar sentiments. I was happy to see he agreed with me here. We did not coordinate this, obviously. This was actually, he was in London in September. But I was happy to see that he kind of had the same ideas, or certainly not the parallels, but he had the same ideas about alliances that I've often said for quite a while. So he was recently in London for International Shipping Week, and he spoke with the Lodestar. The Lodestar did a great article. I'm going to read some of his quotes from that Lodestar article. But so, and I quote from Chairman Dan Maffei, "Would I like to see 25 shipping lines like we had 20 years ago and 4 based in the U.S.? Yes, of course I would. And I certainly thought that there were some abuses of the market power during the pandemic, but there were also a number of other issues that they were blamed for, they being the alliances, that they really couldn't do much about. It was the inland infrastructure and capacity that was the issue." This is what Chairman Dan Maffei from the FMC is saying. So the lines do sometimes get a bad rap. That said, though, they do have a lot of power. They're very, very large organizations, and they're increasingly now gaining other kinds of things like ocean transportation intermediaries, logistics services, etc. Continuing on with Chairman Maffei's quote, "The key thing then is to make sure there's sufficient competition that will drive prices down and hopefully service up. My concern is not so much the current alliance structure, but that's changing with the 2M disappearing. Will it potentially set forth a new wave of mergers and acquisitions which would reduce competition and then therefore be an issue?" Like I said, that's the consolidation I'm talking about, the mergers and acquisitions. Will companies start buying each other up? Which not only then would we not have the 25 shipping lines like we did 20 years ago, or the 9 or 10 shipping lines like we do in present day, we might drop down to 4 or 5. All right, continuing on with Chairman Maffei's quote. But for the most part, as much as I may be concerned about it, I'm also concerned that they're going to go away because there's a lot of pro-competitive effects of alliances. For example, if you're a medium-sized port, you're not going to be served by every carrier. But if 2 carriers can serve you and share a ship, there's more choices. Continuing on in the quote, and that is really what the alliances allow. And provided we do our job well, he's saying we, as in the Federal Maritime Commission, continuing on with his quote, and make sure there is no price collusion or something else that's not allowed, then the bigger concern in my mind is, well, what happens if they do break up and one of the 2M or some other line gets to be so large that the only way other carriers can survive is to combine, and potentially they don't survive. Look, I just wanted to point out today that there's some things happening. It feels like I guess we just went through this strange, wild, will never happen in our lifetime or ever world where we saw $20,000 freight rates. We saw, we saw queue lines of over 100, 150 vessels off the West Coast. We saw the wildest things over the past 2 to 3 years. And now we're just seeing some quiet changes that like I said, I'm sitting up a little straighter. I'm paying attention a little more. Will we see parallels from the mid-2010s to now? The rates are dropping. We didn't have alliances at the time. Alliances were just starting. Now we're seeing potentially alliances going away. Maybe not. Maybe it's just 2M. Maybe that's it. Maybe the EU block exemption going away will actually not have that big of an effect. Maybe the other alliances, THE and Ocean Alliance, are going to remain as they are. Maybe they'll get reshuffled. I said that when we started talking about 2M and the dissolution of 2M. Perhaps we'll see a shuffling or a reshuffling of ocean alliances generally. Maybe we'll see MSC stay on its own. Maybe we'll see Maersk join up with somebody else, potentially Zim. Maybe we'll just see some more slot charters, and smaller vessel sharing agreements. Maybe they won't take on this large global ocean alliance way that we see. Dan Maffei in that same article talks about how while there's kind of 3 major regulatory agencies, you have the European Commission through the Director General for Competition, and you have a similar agency over in China. The 3 agencies get together and they don't sync up exactly how they regulate, but they do have some form of consistency throughout. And so this repeal of the EU block exemption is just a little now inconsistent with the antitrust immunity that the Shipping Act provides. Is it going to be a big deal? Is it going to be a big change? We'll see. Like I said, I think that this is more current day going to be part of larger discussions. I think this will be part of larger conversations that the alliances are going to be having, that I think everybody in the industry should be having. There's some uncertainty, but I wouldn't say that it's pandemonium. I wouldn't say that it's anything to be running scared about yet. I think that the Federal Maritime Commission is paying attention, and I think that the industry is paying attention much, much, much more than it really ever was. So look, continue to pay attention, continue to stay engaged, continue to keep advocating for your position in the industry, because if everybody works together, if everybody continues to pay attention, it's all about the efficiency and the fairness of the movement of all of these cargo containers. 90% of everything moves by ocean cargo shipping. So if you are landside, which arguably 100% moves landside, but if you are landside, make sure you're paying attention to the 90% of everything that's moving by ocean transit. Keep tuning into By Land and By Sea. Appreciate everybody who listens in every week. We have had some great numbers. And as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you do have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, general industry information, and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. Today was a little bit of a circumspect, just watching little nuances that I've been paying attention to, but I really appreciate everybody paying attention and staying involved and engaged with the industry. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and By Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and By Sea, presented by The Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, The Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.